Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first off, I just want to say good morning and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today for how to create effective program communications. And before we get started, I have a couple of items to go over with all of you. So first off, you can ask questions throughout the webinar. You'll notice there's a Q&A button. This is the Zoom platform. You should be able to find that pretty easily. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll go ahead and go through some of the questions. Next, if you are going to post to any social media, go ahead and use the following tags that are available here. And then at the end of the webinar, we do have a post-webinar survey that we would love for you to take just a few moments to fill out. It helps us to improve these going forward. And then lastly, we will definitely be sending you the recording of the webinar as well as slides. Generally, we send those out the day after the presentation. So look for those to arrive in your email inbox tomorrow. And now, without further ado, let me go ahead and turn this over to John and Ava, who will introduce themselves.
Good morning. So I'm Ava, and I'm from the communication strategy team at GuideSpark. And my role here is to help our customers leverage GuideSpark Communicate Cloud to meet their program goals and integrate that with their existing communications environment. My background is in change management and internal B2B communications.
And I'm John. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm on the writing team here at GuideSpark. So as you might expect, focused on copy and messaging for the communication campaigns we're going to be talking about today. And so this is nice because traditionally when we sit down with customers, we do so with a writer and a strategist and kind of cover both sides of the process that way. So hopefully giving you a realistic look at how we approach communications with our customers.
Our agenda today is designed with the hope of addressing the big picture of program communications. So we'll start looking at some of the challenges that you face as communicators in today's environment. Then we'll dig into the details of internal program design, including messaging best practices and audience segmentation. We'll look at that big picture of communication planning as it fits into your larger organizational environment. And finally, we want to finish up with some action items that you can use to strengthen your existing comms programs and really apply what we talk about today.
Awesome. And before we jump into the first slide, Melinda, can you just confirm we have like chat functionality and all that stuff going? I'm not actually seeing it pop up right now on my end. Just want to make sure.
Yeah, the chat should be just fine. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Must just be a me thing. Okay. Okay, so before we get into the meat of the presentation, start talking about some communication sort of hacks and things we can think about to improve campaigns. Essentially wanted to just cover why we're even here today, why we think communication strategy is critical. And it kind of just boils down to the fact that the audience that we're communicating with typically is not a captive audience, although we might like to convince ourselves otherwise. So employees, you know, being the subject of so much communication at all times through text and emails and social media, these statistics were compiled before the pandemic. So at this point in our social media, yeah, I don't think so. And basically this mindset that we get when we're constantly consuming messages from every angle is one of trying to discern if messages are relevant to us. And that extends into employee communication, the communications we receive from employers. And so we have to take an eye to that when we communicate with employees, or messages won't get through. So we talk about that as cutting through the noise epidemic and helping our messages stand out to people that are essentially constantly consuming communications. So before we get to mapping out our programs and get into the first step, we're gonna warm up with a little poll this morning. So get a quick temperature check on how we're viewing some elements of communication already. So you'll see that poll on your screen, and feel free to click your choice there. And we'll just take a couple seconds to do so. If you have your headphones in and you're walking the dog, you can't click, no worries. And oh, now I see the chat functionality. Awesome. Okay, great. So it looks like we are focused on the relevance materials. The correct answer, no, just kidding, there's not a correct answer. All are important. That one specifically, we're going to touch on pretty much right away, but we will get to all three today. Yeah, so let's get into it.
Yeah, so in order to make sure your programs are as effective as you want them to be, a really critical place to start is with kind of a roadmap of your programs. And a lot of folks don't have that program map available as a reference point. So for me, program mapping is an absolutely vital tool for healthy programs. If you don't have a core program map that gets revisited at least annually, I would really encourage you to consider working that into your yearly planning exercises. A program map should include new and upcoming plans and programs as well as existing ones. Another key element of those program maps is they need to show the type of communication needed. Is this a year-long annual program? Is this a moderate term program, maybe a few weeks or a few months? And it's also great if you can get on there those kind of pop-up communications, those just one-time messages that are going to come up across every single year, so that you really can see everything that's going to be going out, everything that needs to go out. You also need to evaluate the way each of those programs is run. Or do you have one stakeholder who runs all your program or one team? Or do you have individual stakeholders or teams for each of your programs? Because that will impact the way you need to coordinate those programs to make sure that they work together effectively. It's also great to consider if the lift is reasonable for each of those teams. And I see someone talking about what do we mean by programs? That's a great question. So when I'm talking about programs, I'm thinking about different areas that require communication. So there could be a benefits program at your organization, for example, and they're going to be communicating kind of year-round benefits information, maybe a focus on 401k at one point, a focus on wellness programs at another point, spotlighting medical, dental, vision another time of the year, and then of course during that open enrollment season, making sure employees are educated about that. You also have maybe your compensation program. You want to communicate to employees how their compensation is going to work across the year when bonuses are coming up, or a performance management program. Employees need to be educated about how they're being evaluated for effectiveness in their role. Even programs like hiring and onboarding, all of these are different areas of your organization that have kind of a unique communication program. So hopefully that addresses your question a little bit. And so once you've taken the time to map out each of these areas and what's required for each of them, then you get that big picture view. And if you're noticing that you have maybe 6 different very substantial year-long programs, and they're going to want to be sending weekly messages, you have that big picture view to say, how can we adjust that so that that's going to work for our employees? And you're making adjustments with that big picture view so that you don't fix one area at the expense of another.
Awesome. And when we get those programs mapped and everything kind of consolidated and in one place, makes designing communication around those programs a heck of a lot easier. So when we go to figure out what type of communication a given program is going to merit, we essentially bracket communication into 3 types. So the first being temporal communications. The word temporal makes you think of shrimp tempura. You're not alone. So this type of communication is essentially going to be serving a standalone message or one-off sort of announcement, business update, maybe an executive is coming on board, essentially something that doesn't need a lot of lead in or follow-up, and that can be serviced by the single message. It might be an announcement and then a message, and but doesn't require a campaign. And where the campaign comes in is what we call transitional communication. So transitional meaning essentially a period of change with a defined beginning and end date that's going to deserve communication throughout that process to keep folks kind of marching toward education or adoption or whatever we want to do. And with transitional communication, one thing that's going to be pretty critical is establishing milestones throughout the process to make sure that folks are kind of staying tuned in and things are progressing. So in the case of onboarding, with pretty much every customer we run that campaign with, folks come in with similar sort of checkpoints. So, you know, leading up to day one for new employees, we want to start getting managers and buddies jazzed. And then on day one, we're checking in at the end of the first week, 30 days, 60, 90, et cetera, to make sure that things are staying consistent. And we're making sure to basically ensure whether we actually want to communicate on those days or just have check-ins, you know, making sure that buddies like check in at every point, or that we send communication that it's consistent. And then the third type is ongoing. So this is the communication best suited to an annual offering, something that's cyclical every year. It's being done. So the example there, benefits open enrollment could be a performance conversation that's occurring at the middle of the year, or the end, or a compensation conversation. And instead of kind of creating those campaigns anew every single year as we know they're coming, we're able to essentially put communications on a track and leverage automation and other things to make those programs, rather those communications, more effective. And at GuideSpark, we leverage what we refer to as communicate journeys for this type of communication. So it's kind of our proprietary blend of content and communications and data that allows us to track employee engagement through that process, leveraging automation and other things like that to make those communications consistent. So those are the three types of communications. And basically, when you map, like I said, when you map your programs out, this becomes a lot easier. And then from here, we can get into our communication goals.
Yeah, so it's really critical to achieve the results that you want to organization-wide to make sure your communication goals are mapped to a business goal. And this is a little bit of an example of what that might look like for a couple different scenarios. And then once you've got those clear goals, that provides kind of the top level for you to design your messaging so that it's getting you to that goal. And the key that tends to fall off for a lot of folks when they're looking at messaging is you want to make sure that you're designing messaging with an outcome in mind. What action do I want to drive that's going to move the dial towards that business goal that I'm trying to support? Effective messaging should prompt either a very clear takeaway or a specific action. In order to do that, you have to have a little bit of a pulse on the employees that you're trying to reach. You have to make sure that you have a feel for how much pre-existing knowledge employees already have so that your messaging is meeting them where they are, instead of either being dismissed as irrelevant because it's too basic or being dismissed as irrelevant because they have no idea what you're talking about and there's really no entry point for them to get on board. That way, so a little bit of a poll sent out before you start a new campaign in a new area, or just taking the time to have some informal conversations with managers and individual contributors can make sure that you're able to meet employees where they are and provide the context necessary when you launch that campaign.
Awesome. And there was a question put in the chat, basically just regarding agility and the ability to adjust to things that pop up during the year. So you set your calendar maybe at the beginning of the year, but then I don't know, maybe a pandemic happens and priorities shift a little bit. And so how can we sort of adjust for that? I want to get into that, the bulk of that question towards the end of the presentation, but it does actually pertain to this slide, which is centered around that relevancy that Ava was just talking about in terms of making sure that all the work we're doing to create messaging is not for naught if we're not tapped in with the employees that we're actually communicating to. So to account for that agility, if we're tapped into audience preferences and communication habits, that adjustment, that that turning on a dime to communicate about something gets a lot easier. And so this is essentially about establishing a communication profile for audiences as we go. So the first element of this is going to be who exactly we want to talk to about a given program. So say we are adjusting our performance management process, making an update to it. It's actually something we're doing for a customer right now, so it's on my brain. So for something like that, we would probably want to communicate to employees and managers in different ways, obviously different sides of that process. And maybe we just want to focus on managers, but establishing those sort of personas and the different communication needs across those groups at the outset is effective. We want to consider where they are, so location, both in terms of, hey, when we send out these messages, if we send them to, folks in the West Coast in the morning, hitting the East Coast at noon, and making sure that we're counting for that when we're sending out messages. But then also there's legality issues to be aware of when we are communicating across states or countries, for incentives and financial programs and benefits. These things are going to vary across locations. So we wouldn't want to blanket communicate about those things necessarily. And then for day-to-day experience, basically just pertaining to where folks are, in their daily workflow. So this is one obviously heavily impacted by the pandemic. Most folks working from home these days. But if we are trying to communicate to, say, a deskless workforce, or maybe a partially distributed workforce, sending an email in the middle of the day, if it's not going to hit some folks, directly with an email, we're going to need to change up communication accordingly. And then kind of on that same token, where are employees already consuming information? Where do they expect certain announcements to appear? Is that on Slack? Is that through email? A lot of our companies leverage intranet sites, functioning as kind of a community message board. So making use of those things. All that is important. And as we learned in the last 12 months, these things are kind of always changing. So again, establishing kind of tabs on this information and adjusting as things evolve makes future campaigns a heck of a lot easier, so we can be more agile when we need to. And then kind of on the other side of that is, okay, we've established that information, or we're continuing to establish that information. And then when it comes time to actually deliver communications, we're able to, okay, say we want to utilize different personas for a given campaign. We want to segment messages accordingly. So communicating, 3 messages instead of 1 to the whole company. Cadence, so what time of day, what time of week, how often are we sending messages? There's obviously some research, some analytics to back some of that stuff, but again, we want to take into account the preferences of the given employee population. Same for the channel. The one thing that I think is universal when it comes to channel usage is essentially just diversifying to the greatest extent possible. You'll always have those employees that aren't the best about checking email, and ones that might have a Slack channel, perennially muted. So spreading communications across those channels kind of accounts for that. And then the tone of our messaging, we can kind of adapt it based both on the different employee groups. So folks might be coming into the experience with different levels of knowledge or experience around the program, so adjusting the tone for that. And then also, if we're communicating about something, like a cultural program as opposed to maybe like a 401k, the tone's going to be a little different there as well. And then the last thing I'll say about this, before I kick it back to Ava, is basically when a writer and a strategist sit down with a customer to start a map or rollout, we essentially, so I as the writer will kind of account more for the technical side of messaging and best practices and stuff like that, and the strategist will be tapped into the customer goals. And we essentially try to marry those two sides of communication whenever we are assisting a customer. And I kind of recommend that, for your internal teams, if you can establish a couple, kind of a core team of stakeholders to try to bounce ideas off that way and kind of handle both sides of that equation, I think that's pretty effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for what it's worth, for timing and cadence, I'm a Tuesday, Thursday girl. I don't think anybody is paying that much attention to anything but what they need to get their week started on a Monday. And I think by Friday, people are tapped out. That being said, you can't have everybody sending messages on Tuesday and Thursday, or people are going to be bombarded. So that gets us to this managing communications across the enterprise portion of the program. The best campaigns with carefully segmented audiences and really cleverly crafted messaging will get lost in the shuffle if they haven't been properly situated in the larger communication ecosystem. I really recommend trying to align with a shared company calendar. In the GuideSpark Communicate Cloud, we've developed a Communicate Planner tool that shows every campaign being run across a customer's account. So even if you don't work personally on that campaign, you can still see when messages are going out for it, so that you have that visibility to know, hey, it's open enrollment. People are getting a ton of benefits messages this week. This isn't a great week to send my CEO business update. Maybe I'll wait until next week. So it can be a tricky thing to get those shared calendars set up, but it's worth the effort. Someone was asking earlier about being agile and being able to pivot. And I think we really get into that when we look at identifying key program dates. And this works both to kind of plan for that upheaval, and it provides built-in agility points for unexpected upheaval, right? Because we don't know when there's going to be a major social justice flashpoint that needs to be addressed. We don't know when there's going to be, a natural disaster or something else that we need to deal with. But by having set program milestones where you were already checking in on your program to see how successful it's going to be, provides a built-in kind of escape hatch where you can change your approach. It's really critical, even if nothing happens in the larger world that upsets your planning, to have those dates where you can evaluate the effectiveness based on whatever you decided your goals are, so that you don't get to the end of a campaign and go, oh, well, that didn't work. We want to know if things aren't working before the end of the campaign, because you can change your tactics. If emails aren't getting, the eyes that you want, change channels, change time of day, change delivery day, change messaging. Choose something to adjust before your next checkpoint, and then see if you got there. Especially with long-term campaigns, phased objectives are really, really critical. Have a clear goal for what you want to accomplish each quarter for a year-long campaign, so that you can evaluate if you've achieved that before moving on to a different section of the campaign. And if you miss one goal, then it builds in that room to pivot, to think about what happened, so that you can adjust before there's a larger issue at the end of your campaign. And also, for those of you working in the context of a large organization, sometimes your organization's strategic priorities, they change, right? And since your communication goals are mapping to those strategic priorities, you need to be able to change with them. So planning for that change and just considering iteration on your campaign a natural part of the campaign life cycle will really set you up for success. And making sure that those things aren't just hypothetical, like, oh, well, I could adjust this later, but like put a date on your calendar to sit down and check in on that campaign. And we were a little bit curious, since we're here talking about how important it is to have eyes on other programs. We were wondering what you all are doing currently to manage and strategize those internal communications across your organizations. Do you have a framework in place? Are you using maybe like a spreadsheet, or do you have a calendar? So we would love it if you would just take a minute to provide some feedback there.
Super anonymous.
Yeah, we're definitely not going to send you an email about this, I promise. Just curious. I think it can be really eye-opening for people too when they see what other groups are doing, because you can also it also opens up room for that collaboration internally, right? You can see how other folks are communicating. You can talk about what's working and what's not, and maybe share some best practices, share some successes, save someone from making the same mistake you did. Yeah. So it looks like most folks have some sort of tool that they're using, maybe just chatting as across teams, or using a spreadsheet. A few people don't have a framework, and then some folks have moved up to a calendar. So it's great to see that that's on people's minds already. And we've really seen the success for folks who take the time to build out those practices. And so what that looks like at GuideSpark, just as an example in the Communicate Cloud, is this Communicate Planner tool. We know that centralized visibility is so important. We want you to be able to see the communications across your organizations, every message on every channel and every campaign. Something I would recommend that you add to whatever tool you're using is the audience that it's going to, because you might pull up this tool and see that next week looks absolutely packed with emails, but if you click open that message and take a peek at the audience that it's going to, you might see that it's not the audience that you're talking to. So there's actually plenty of room for you to send the comms that you need. So it's really important that you have the channel, maybe a little bit about the messaging, as well as the audience visible to everybody.
Great. Okay, so we're coming down the home stretch here. So at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about, the need to cut through the noise and sort of this phenomenon of constant messaging that we're facing at all times. And when we're able to use some of the things we're talking about today to kind of create a through line to employees and sort of, allow sort of a tunnel of communication to exist that we can use for successive campaigns, that's great, that's ideal. But then there's this other pitfall that we can fall into, which is essentially to overuse that channel and contribute to this other phenomenon of essentially digital overload that has kind of gone wild in the last year or so. So many more messages being sent at all times, people in over twice as many virtual meetings, checking your messages every 5 minutes or so. And again, when we talk about the state of communications from the recipient's view, folks talk a lot about burnout and that place that employees can get to where we kind of just, shut down and become much more difficult to get to or to reach. Obviously, we want to avoid that at all costs, and we can do that by being efficient and precise in messaging. And so it's kind of an empathy thing in terms of accounting for where employees are at and not wanting to contribute to this feeling of overzealous communication or being overwhelmed. And so kind of the solve in between the cutting through and the oversaturation is this orchestration of internal messaging around a view of everything that employees are going through and all that they're receiving, so that we can increase the power of each campaign and cut through the noise. And when we're able to do that, we can kind of get to the real end game, which is to align the organization around a goal or a set of goals, communication goals, so we can drive outcomes that actually matter to the organization.
And so we promised you some action items from this. So our hope is that what you take away from this is the idea that it's really important to take the time to take stock of your current program ecosystem. We all know that we're not the only game in town, right? Or even if you are the only game in town and you're running multiple programs, take a look at how those puzzle pieces fit together, so that you can communicate with empathy for your employees and all that they're being faced with, as well as really strategically for your organization. Next, you want to determine those goals and the voice that will drive each communication. Like you said at the beginning, relevance is the currency that you have with your viewers, right? So do them the courtesy of sending a message that you're clear on what you want this message to do. You're sending it for a reason, and the voice behind the messaging makes sense to drive that outcome. It will really help engage your viewers and make sure that your messages don't get set in the auto delete pile. Next, take the time to understand that audience. Segmenting audiences it's work, right? We all know that it's work. But when you can be really intentional about the people that you're reaching with different messages or different tone, or slightly different messaging, then again, you increase that relevance, you increase the likelihood of driving the outcomes that you're looking for. Next, for you as communicators, take the time to plan communications for the long term. We know that's necessary because we need to see that big picture, but really concretely mark in those milestones where you can iterate, where you can pivot if you need to, where you can check your work, right? See if those results are trending in the direction that you want them to be trending, and build in some breathing room for yourself to respond to the changes that we know are going to happen and that we can't control. Changes in strategic priorities, changes in the cultural, social, political, whatever landscape that you need to address. If you build in that breathing room, it really can do a lot to lower your stress levels and make your programs more successful. And finally, if you're whether you're currently using big picture viewpoint like a spreadsheet or a calendar, or if you haven't gotten there yet, take some time to improve that or invest some energy into that tool so that you can really make sure your message is in context with your larger communication environment. Maybe talk to some other teams about what's working for them or what they've noticed. But most of all, make sure that you have that visibility into what's going out when and to whom, so that you can fit in your campaigns, your messages, where they're going to be most impactful. We know that we do what we do because we know that effective communication is so critical, right? Our business success relies on successful communication. You drive those outcomes, you drive those goals. So it's work to build these programs, and it takes, really thoughtful effort, but it's worth the effort in the long run, because you see those outcomes come to life.
Great. So there's just a couple questions that popped up in the Q&A. I know where you've come up to our time, so if you can stick with us a few more minutes, that's great. But John, let me start with you. So one question came up: what are some ways to evaluate the success or effectiveness of communications in getting through to employees?
Yeah, so I think about that question in kind of two ways. The first being, you could consider more a quantitative evaluation. So, the data and analytics, the success metrics that we use to essentially track employee engagement throughout a campaign. So for our campaigns, typically we'll track everything from, we send an employee a message, goes to their inbox. Do they click into that message? If so, do they navigate down? Do they take an action and navigate to a piece of content? Do they watch or engage with that piece of content all the way through? Do they then volley to another piece of content? If so, which one? All those type of things help us essentially understand whether or not employees are making their way through an experience and kind of gaining that that education again, or adoption, or whatever we might be looking to reinforce. And then on the other side, the sort of qualitative side of it is essentially employee sentiment and what employees are saying about tracking through an experience. So we have, and again, in our experience, things like ratings. So we just did one recently for coaching and feedback journey, something to the effect of, how comfortable are you giving feedback through, maybe placed, like halfway through the campaign, but then again towards the end, trying to gauge folks' level of comfort after having digested those materials. So that's a good indicator. And you can do that outside the experience. You can, post questions on Slack or stuff like that. And then the last one I'll say for my long-winded answer is kind of a classic data point that we pay attention to is, what is the state of the internal teams that are typically tasked with answering questions about a given program. So if we have, our HR teams during open enrollment, in the past, companies would come to us because their HR teams are essentially answering the same questions over and over and over, and they're sick and tired of not, seeing a basic level of education around benefits for their employees. And so, if we check in, say 3 months into a campaign, and they are answering those questions less, that's a good indicator that we're successful, and also just improves their quality of life. And that's
great. All right, awesome. And Ava, maybe you want to follow up. There's another question here about benchmarks. What kinds of benchmarks, do you recommend as well to measure what's happening internally?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the answer is that there's not a one-size-fits-all benchmark that you should be shooting for, but it is really helpful for you to start gathering some data so that you know you can measure against your own past successes or areas that need improvement. So start gathering that data on email open rates, on call to action clicks, if you have a link that you want folks clicking on, how many people are clicking it, and then also on program participation. And that again should be quantitative data, like maybe the percentage of employees who participate in quarterly check-ins for a performance management program, as well as qualitative data like surveying managers regarding the quality of those conversations at quarterly check-ins over time. So the key is just to be gathering your own data on the same metrics over a long period of time so that you can measure your own improvement.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll leave it there. So just a quick note, if you want to advance this, yeah, there we go. Just a quick note. So we have 2 more webinars in this series that are coming up. Our next one is June 1st, and we will go ahead and be sending all of you invites to that as well as we continue kind of this discussion around employee communications. Go ahead, I think, and hit return again there, John. Just a little note to remember that you want to be able to cut through the noise to reach and engage your employees with GuideSpark. And then lastly, thank you. So we really do appreciate you guys joining us today. We know everyone is really busy, and it was great sharing this with you all, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Don't forget that post-webinar survey. It'll pop up as you exit. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks so much.